it really is remarkable what we've seen. Just the images from just yesterday are just really crazy and heartbreaking stuff. And I mean, how do you even contemplate something like this? Like there's just a boat on your balcony all of a sudden. I mean, where do you even get started trying to clean this stuff up? So we have, I think, 2.5 million people in Florida without power right now. It's unknown how many people perished yesterday. It's terrible. And the cleanup effort is going to be massive and just incredible amounts of property damage. And, you know, it's amazing. I'm on the east side of Florida, far away from where this thing hit. And here in Delray Beach, not far from me, I mean, it still tore the roofs off of structures like this. So if you're interested, here are a couple places you can go to donate to disaster relief: Florida Disaster Fund, the Red Cross, or if you want to do just something quick and easy, you can do a quick $10 donation by texting disaster to that number for the Florida Disaster Fund, or texting Ian to 90999 for the Red Cross. Okay, let's get that out of the way and let's move on to happier topics. And again, please hit that chat button and say hi to all your friends and colleagues from across the industry. As always, make sure to pick the all panelists and attendees or everyone option, because otherwise you will only be chatting with Sean, Emily, and myself, and we probably won't have a chance to respond while we present. So make sure you say hi to everyone, let them know where you're from, and let them know you're safe, because we all care about one another. All right, we have some brand new content, awesome reports in Report Pro. One table, which was published a little while back, we want to continue calling that out. If you haven't had a chance to check it out yet, please do. This tells you everything you need to about what's happening with supply chain inflation, labor shortages, and what it means for restaurants and other operators across the industry. And it's completely free for the industry as well. So check out this report. You can get it right now in Report Pro if you haven't already. There's a wonderful new Trend Watch edition as well that talks about what's next in terms of the biggest new flavor trends that are right around the corner. Give that one a read. And wonderful new inspiration report you'll find in Report Pro 2 on health and wellness trends. So if you're doing an ideation or just thinking about what your health and wellness strategy is, this is a great report. And this one is really fun, and maybe one of the most fun reports we've seen in a while, which is all about pet-friendly food service venues. Now, it seems like way more places are dog-friendly or pet-friendly these days, right? You know, they have yappy hours and that type of thing, but it actually reminded me of a story. This is one of my all-time favorite stories that I'd seen on the news. Do you remember this from a few years ago? I guess this is early 2016. Right, so yes, you know, so more places are allowing you to bring in dogs or whatever, but this guy took it a step further and got onto an airplane with his service turkey. Can you imagine just being there and all of a sudden seeing this thing pop its head up?
Yeah.
So I actually figure this is sort of a good segue, because should the turkey be something you find on the plane, or should it be something that you find on the menu? And from there, we will start our conversation around the current state of the menu for 2022 and beyond. And again, Sean and Emily are preeminent experts on all things related to the menu, and they'll be joining us to talk about what we're going to be seeing for the next year and beyond. Okay, so a lot of the data today is going to come from a few different sources. One of the major ones is Menu Trends, which I believe many, if not most of your companies are already using right now. If you're not, call us and we'll tell you more about it. But it's basically a giant historic data set of menus with really great analytics built in. And we wanted to look at a few things that have happened on menus. And I think if we look at what happened last year, 2021, you could really characterize it by menus having gotten just smaller. So we've actually excluded alcoholic beverages from some of this analysis that's going to follow, because things like wine lists get so incredibly big that they throw the numbers off. But if you look at everything outside of alcohol, immediately following COVID, menus shrunk by about 9%, almost 10%. actually. And that was really sort of the major story, right? Remember back then, a lot of restaurants slashed their menu in half, or removed breakfast options entirely, or removed a bunch of center plate options because they weren't doing dine-in service. That's what we saw in the immediate aftermath of COVID. And the question is, well, what happened in the years since? So that's the 2021 menu trend in terms of the size of a menu, the number of items on a menu. What happened in 2022? And there's some arguments for how, maybe the reasons that menus could have gotten bigger, right? It could be that menus started reverting back to their historic sizes. They had natural room to grow as they rebounded from the shrinkage that we saw following COVID. It could be population migration, where you have people moving from tier 1 cities and places like New York, Chicago, LA, where they have all these wonderful food trends, and going to second and third tier cities and bring their appetites with them. So that those restaurants would have to offer new things to satisfy that migrating audience, right? That would be another reason that menus might grow in 2022, or would have grown in 2022. And also pent-up innovation. Think of all those restaurants and chefs and culinary creative types that want to just do something new on their menu, but didn't have the chance to do it as they were downsizing during COVID. So these are all arguments for why menus may have grown. On the flip side, though, there's certainly some arguments for why menus may have continued to shrink over the course of the last year. You have everything that's happened with supply chain, labor, and inflation, all those topics that we talk about in the one table research, right? Those have created extraordinary margin pressures that have led to many operators saying we want to sort of focus back on the basics or on the core to help us manage our business better, because it's just too unpredictable right now. And then also you have a whole lot of people still working from home. I'm guessing many of you right now are technically working, but at home as we speak. And what does that do for the number of lunch options you still need at restaurants, right? If you're not, if you don't have people out and about during the day for lunch or for a breakfast commute. So you have a couple of things that on each side that might promote restaurant menus growing in size versus shrinking. And I think I wanted to maybe ask all of you what you think actually happened. So over the course of the last year, we're going to tell you the real answer in just a moment. Do you think that restaurant menus got bigger, got smaller, or did the forces cancel themselves out and stayed the same size? This is actually interesting. Sean, Emily, can you see the numbers, or can only I see the numbers as they come in?
You can see the numbers, but I can see some people commenting in the chat.
Okay.
A couple of people said smaller. One person just said the same.
So if you guys had to guess, what do you think the votes are coming in as?
Well,
I think it's gonna be more smaller and the same.
Okay. Sean, do you concur?
I'm actually looking at the chat, so that would be unfair to say, but yeah, that's what we're seeing in the chat.
Okay, well, let's see what people think. So I'm going to end the poll right now. We're at about 45 seconds. This group of very informed industry professionals primarily thinks that menus got smaller. About a quarter thinks that menus stayed the same size. Only 9% think that menus actually grew in size.
I wouldn't have expected the smaller to be that
Well,
big
I
of
think
percentage.
also, I mean, we probably have a number of folks on today that are, deeply engaged in the industry and are experiencing
right.
very firsthand what's happening with supply chain and inflation and labor and some of those very direct forces that could promote menus to get a little bit smaller. So that's what we thought, right? The 2/3 think that menus got smaller. Let's see what actually happened, though. This is a view of the average size of a menu. Again, this excludes alcoholic beverages because wine lists make the numbers just go crazy when you have 10,000 wines on a menu. This is the average size of a menu over time. So keep in mind that 2020, the 2020 line here represents our pre-COVID number. This is before the impact of COVID. 2021 is the immediate aftermath where you see a really steep drop. And 2022, this past year, is essentially flat with 2021. So the actual right answer is that menu sizes stayed the same. And it's for the reasons that we mentioned earlier, that you had a lot of things that were promoting menu growth and at the same time things promoting menu decline, and they netted out to be just about even. And I think the way that I would tend to think about this, and Emily and Sean, I would invite you to comment too, is we're sort of right in the early to midst of a rebound, right? We saw a decline in the immediate wake of COVID, and we're at that point right now where things are just starting to rebound and turn around. They're not shrinking anymore. Sometimes they're going up, sometimes they're staying a little bit flat, but it seems like we're just sort of, making that little rebound effect. And you can actually see that this is happening at different rates in different parts of the industry. So if we look at restaurants, for example, and we split those out between limited service and full service restaurant segments, the numbers that you see here in 2021 represents how much those menus changed in size versus the prior year, right? Fine dining got hammered, like those menus shrunk 25%. A 100-item menu became a 75-item menu all of a sudden. Casual dining down a lot, mid-scale dining, QSR down the least, but fast casual also down quite a bit.
Right.
In 2022, this most recent year, we could see that the trends have changed. One, you don't see the steep declines that we saw in 2021. And you actually see increases in size in limited service restaurants, and in particular at fast casual restaurants that grew at almost 2.5% in size. So didn't quite make up for the loss experienced in 2021, but starting to move back in that positive direction. But again, limited service tends to be growing in menu size, and full service tends to be a little bit more flat to mildly down. And if we look at this by the parts of the menu, we see some interesting effects as well. Appetizers and sides, and to some extent beverages, tend to be down a little bit in terms of the number of options available on menus today. But entrees have grown a bit in size, and desserts have actually started to grow a bit in size after suffering a pretty steep decline in 2021. Emily, Sean, any commentary or any thoughts on what we're observing here, what might be driving it?
I think what's interesting is that, when you look at the limited service restaurants, right? It's like, we know labor shortages was a major issue, during the past year, during the recovery, quote unquote. So, restaurants that rely like less on, a lot of, labor tend to have grown a little bit more than the other ones. So like ones with fast casual, like with more streamlined, process and that not as labor intensive grew the most.
Yep. Yeah, I think that makes sense. Well,
And then,
yeah,
I was just going
please.
to add for the entree portion, it reminds me of in the one table report that the one question asking operators where they're going to focus, where they plan to focus most of their innovation. And the number one answer is so that makes sense that, of course, this is going to be the focus, whereas maybe the other parts fall off a little bit.
Yeah, it's that sentiment around reverting or focusing more on the core, right? Which is what we saw quite a bit of for a lot of the things that we talk about in one table: supply chain, labor, inflation. Another way that we could think about this is if you imagine all the different things that might appear on a restaurant menu, all the different foods, all the different flavors, all the different ingredients. We track, I think, nearly 11,000 different foods, flavors, ingredients across menus. Everything from A1 to zuppa de pesce, right? I mean, every healthy term, flavor, seasoning, you name it. We could look at in each year how many of those things actually grew in penetration, meaning the number of restaurants that feature it at least once on the menu, versus how many of those, thousands of different foods, flavors, ingredients declined. They became less available to consumers on restaurant menus. So in 2020, which is, let's say, our year before COVID, right? Again, this is our pre-COVID data. About 55% of all foods, flavors, and ingredients became a little bit more available or became more available to restaurants, to consumers on restaurant menus. And about 45% became less available. Their penetration rates shrunk. If we look at 2021, the ratio becomes dramatically different because menus themselves shrunk. Only 18% of foods, flavors, ingredients grew in penetration in 2021 versus 83% roughly that declined in penetration. And the question is, what happened last year as we enter sort of like this COVID recovery period? And we're seeing something that's starting to revert back toward the norm. It's not quite 50-50 yet, but it's getting there. We're at about a 40-60 split right now. So 40% of all foods, flavors, ingredients grew in penetration last year, and about 60% declined in penetration. Now, sometimes those gains and losses are big, sometimes those gains and losses are pretty small, but this is the ratio of gainers to decliners. And what's actually sort of instructive is to look at how this number varies over time. So if you look at that gainers number and the decliners number for each year, and you sort of take the difference between the two, you get sort of a net gainer score. So in 2020, that net gainer score is 11%. In 2021, it is a historic, aberration of a low of minus 65%. And in 2022, this most recent year, it's sitting at a minus 21. And the question is, well, how do these numbers compare to what we've seen historically? So here's a chart that shows you what that net gainer, net decliner number looks like over time, going back about 10 years. And you could see most of the time in most years, sort of like trades between minus 20 to a positive 40, right? That's sort of like the standard band that you'll see. Then all of a sudden with COVID, we dropped to like some astronomically like low number, that minus 65. But we're now at a negative 21, which puts us back in sort of our historic region. So I think we've sort of gotten back to at least the types of patterns we've seen historically. And my guess is, as the recovery continues, is that we'll start seeing that number continue to creep up and enter positive territory, perhaps as soon as a few quarters down the road or sometime next year. And I think that's really our big story, is that we're in the midst of that rebound right now, and that the types of balance we've typically seen on menus, right? The historic consistency of trends moving in a very predictable way, it looks like it has largely been restored at this point. There's still a little bit of chaos out there with all the things going on with the ripple effects of COVID, but largely trends are starting to function again as they've always functioned in the past. And a lot of those trends that were growing pre-COVID and that then stopped have now resumed and are growing once again as innovation rushes back toward the menu. Now, I want to talk a little bit about some of the metrics that are important here. Historically, we've always had two measures in menu trends that we always orient users around. I'm going to use chicken as an example. So the first measure is penetration, which is the percentage of menus that a specific food flavored ingredient appears on. In the case of chicken, it's like 95%. 19 out of every 20 restaurants have chicken on the menu somewhere. Maybe it's one time on the menu, maybe it's 100 times on the menu, but 95% of restaurants feature chicken. The second number is incidence, which is the percentage of dishes that feature a food flavor ingredient. And in chicken's case, that number is 11.1. So 11% of all dishes on menus feature chicken, right? Makes sense. There is a third number that we've never really sort of exposed publicly before, but it actually becomes quite important as we analyze what's happened over the last couple of years as things have really been chaotic. And that's something that we call share, which is the percentage of terms. So you imagine all the different, ingredients, flavors, descriptions that could appear inside of a menu item across all of those menus. This looks at the share of all those terms that a specific food flavor ingredient represents. For chicken, that number is 1.52. And you can see we've carried it out one additional decimal point because these numbers get really, really, really small. Chicken is just about the most common thing you'll find out there, and it's barely over 1%. So 1.52% of all things you'll find mentioned on a menu are chicken, right? So in a given menu item, you might have like 20 different terms. Chicken over the span of all menus is about 1.5% of all of those. So I want to show you some things that we learned when we looked at things on a share basis.
And it's more meaningful, Jack, right? Too, because we said the menu size didn't change. So looking at share and looking at like how share changes, make more sense.
Yeah, so Sean brings up a really great point, which is because there's been a lot of chaos over the last couple of years of some restaurant menus getting a lot smaller, then some getting a lot bigger to bounce right back, or some just sort of moving in much bigger swings than you would normally see. We wanted to introduce a measure that would account for that and give us some more stability as the data itself starts to normalize as we recover from COVID. So understanding share sort of puts everything, you know, in an apples to apples comparison, if you will. So what we can learn.
Hey, Jack,
Yeah.
in the chat, I think if we clarify one more time what share is, you know, someone gave an example, like in the dish Nashville hot chicken sandwich, you're saying chicken is a quarter share of that item, if it's just those 4 words, right?
Yes, it's actually chicken would be a quarter of all the food related terms in there. So, you know, Nashville hot might be one term.
Right.
Chicken might be another term, and sandwich might be another term. So it might be one out of, let's say, those 3 in that case. Right. But you can imagine how complex a lot of menu items get with really long names and very, very long descriptions. You know, if you're at a 1% share, that's a massive, massive number. Most things on menus have a much, much, much smaller share than that. We're using chicken because it's such an obvious example. So what percentage of all things that could describe food on a menu does this particular thing represent is what share is. So we can look too at all the different, let's say, things that fall into different categories. So I think of all the different side dishes or things that relate to a side dishes, or think of all the different types of breads that are out there, or all the hundreds of different flavors, sauces, and spices. And we've aggregated each one of those into these buckets that you see here. So we want to understand in each one of these buckets, how many of the things inside that bucket gained share over the course of the last year. In the side dish category, which consists of, you know, rice and beans and, you know, pretty much anything else that you could have as a side dish, probably hundreds of items, 53% of them grew in share on the menu. A lot of that is due to center of plate items having disappeared in 2021 and storming back in 2022, and often many of those items being menued with a side dish included. But you can look at some of these other categories. Breads, 48% of bread items grew in share relative to everything else on the menu. And the numbers sort of go from there. And I thought it might be helpful to just sort of double click on one of these categories to really understand what the numbers mean. So I think we track almost 100 different types of bread. You can't fit 100 things on a chart. So I sort of eliminated a bunch of the stuff that's in the middle. But let's take a quicker and closer look at bread. And before we do that, you know, do you guys know what this is, Sean, Emily?
I do not.
It seems to be some sort of toaster.
I thought that would be an easy answer. So that's why I was like, I do not know.
Does anyone in chat know what this is? I mean, you sort of hit the nail on the head with the way it is. Some sort of toaster is actually a pretty good description. This thing is called the Mitsubishi bread oven. It's supposed to make the best toast ever made. It is a single slice toaster. It only makes one slice of toast at a time. And it's like $350 for something.
Oh, wow.
It's expensive, but it's supposed to be incredible.
It looks like it's from the 80s. I thought it was the old,
no, this is
super old toaster.
This is a brand new device. You could buy it on Amazon right now. If you watch any of the videos that review this thing, they say it's just it changes your perception of what bread can be when you toast something. But it only does one piece of bread at a time.
So you can do a sandwich with it. Like it's really just for bread.
I think there might be a way you can do a sandwich if you sort of, I guess if you press 2 pieces of bread together with something inside, you can maybe do like a panini type of thing.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be, they'd say that just fundamentally changes the taste of the bread. And like I said, I don't know how to cook, but I'm like this close to splurging on this thing because it sounds so amazing. Does anyone in chat have any experience with this? Is it worth the money? It sounds incredible. You all should watch like one of the YouTube videos that talks about it. I mean, people go to like an ecstatic state when they finally taste like the toast or whatever they made. in this thing. So it's called the Mitsubishi bread oven. Look it up. And if any of you have ever used it or have experience and can recommend it or not, I would actually love to know, because I'm this close to pulling the trigger. Anyways, let's talk about some bread. So I've stripped out the breads that didn't really grow or didn't shrink very much, that are essentially zero. And we're just showing some relative examples of things like ruined share versus lost share in the bread category over the course of the last year. I mean, Emily, do you have any observations as to what we're seeing happen over here in these numbers?
Yeah, so over to the left, it's a lot of staples like wheat, whole wheat, rye, but it's also global inspired or like Mexican inspired tortilla, flour tortilla. And then of course, the, trend darling sourdough.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing, Sean, and I don't know if you're seeing the same thing, is one, in the immediate aftermath of COVID, you saw a lot of lunch options start to go away.
Right.
People weren't available, and sandwiches are very common for lunch, and a lot of the breads that you see here that have grown in share over the past year may have been the same ones that lost share
during COVID
because of, let's say, lunch consolidation.
Right. And
yeah.
And I think Emily and I were talking earlier too about the data. And I think one of the things that, Emily, I think you mentioned, like I don't remember like making sandwiches for lunch during COVID. So I think people, one of the things we talked about before was like people were craving food when, they're getting back to restaurants, and some of the food that they're making from home was not maybe as high priority. So you would think sandwiches would be an easy thing to make at home. But I think people during COVID, you saw more and more people kind of experimenting with cooking and doing things like that. So sandwiches could have been something also that people were craving, and and that's why we kind of see a growth in that, because people are going out more for lunch and eating sandwiches with some of the kind of staple bread types.
I think you said it well. So we see some of those staple breads returning because of the rebound of sandwiches, and at the same time you see some, let's say, non-traditional sandwich breads that are growing because there's an underlying trend where those things were going pre-COVID and are now resuming their growth post-COVID. You see the same thing like in the noodle category as well, right? You see some noodles are relatively declining over the past year, and some are relatively growing in share. I don't know if Emily, if you had an observation here.
Yeah, so we're seeing some similar like global themes on the left side, of course, with rice noodle, yakisoba, and soba. Cavatappi is there. In the past, that's been trending with mac and cheese, so that makes sense. It's on the up and up in that way. And then on the right side, we have very classic Italian noodles like spaghetti and penne. And, those tend to be a little less versatile than something like rice noodle, which is in pho, which is in all sorts of Asian cuisine dishes. And we were looking at the data a lot, and yakisobas and like stir fry, like build your own stir fry restaurants too. So that goes along with a lot of different options on menus to incorporate that noodle.
Yeah, and it seems like, go ahead, Sean.
No, I was gonna say, like, and Emily, I think you brought it up too, like when we were talking earlier about gluten-free, right? Like, gluten-free it tends to be a big trend. And I think, Emily was saying, like, her friends, like, would really see it as rice noodles as like one of the only options when they go to like Thai restaurants and things like that for a gluten-free offering. And I think we see that in the chats too. A lot of people are mentioning that as well.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I think like the sandwich story was one story where it's mostly rebound. Here we're seeing something a little bit different that's related more to, maybe there's a little bit of the dietary piece, but maybe also it's just the underlying trend piece that's not related to COVID. It's that some things are growing in prominence. And look, we always talk about, what is American food, and we often take Chinese, Italian, and Mexican, and they almost feel like subsets of American at some point, which could explain some of the phenomenon that you're seeing here as well.
And I think there's charts, actually, Jack, I think there's like maybe the, 2 or 3 things happening at the same time, right? Like, because there's so much that happened over the past year, like recovery was one, people returning to restaurants, supply chain. So I think there could be
Yeah.
when we kind of when we dig into the data and we provide reports, we try to like look for all of those stories.
Yeah, you have to separate it out. And I think that's why like that first question that we started today with, which is, do y'all think that menus grew or shrank, is
Right.
so important, because there are some things that cause them to grow and some things that cause them to shrink. And your net change was basically zero. But you can't say, oh, nothing happened. Actually, a whole lot happened. You just had headwinds and tailwinds simultaneously, and you have to be able to break those out. So there's an interesting thing that we've looked at in the past, which is sort of the bell curve, if you will, for what grows and what shrinks on menus. And I can take a quick second to explain how this chart works. So I'm going to show you what 2019 menus look like relative to 2018. So if you think about all those thousands of things, foods, flavors, ingredients, seasonings, everything you might find on a menu, this is the percentage of those items that grew or shrink by at least that amount that you see at the bottom, right? So most things didn't change very much, which is why you have a big spike, or big peak at the zero interval. And then by the time you get out to the outer edges, it's pretty uncommon for something to grow 2 full points on the menu or to shrink 2 full points on the menu, which is why, it flattens quite a bit. And here's what the curve looks like in 2019, right? A lot of stuff, didn't really grow or shrink very much. And then you have, diminishing numbers that grew or shrink by a certain, larger amount. Here's what that same bell curve looks like in 2020. Sort of similar, but you actually saw a little bit more growing than shrinking, which is why that green line, tends to be a little bit further to the right, beyond the 0.0, standard. The question then is, what happened when COVID hit? And you got a really crazy line curve that looks like this, completely unlike anything we'd seen in the past. So this pink line is bizarre for a number of reasons. One, most of it is in the negative territory. 2, there's very few things that grew a lot in 2021. That pink curve flattens very, very quickly. And 3, there's a whole lot of stuff that shrunk, not just shrunk, but shrunk dramatically at the tail end. I don't know if you can see my cursor moving around, but I'm wiggling my mouse right now on the left side of the chart. There's like a whole bunch of stuff that actually shrunk by more than 2 full percentage points on menus, which is normally unheard of. So the question is, what did we see in 2022? Did we see a curve that looks a little bit more like 2021? Did we see its mirror image in the opposite direction? Or did we see something that was more of a reversion to the norm? And here's that 2022 curve, and it's really a reversion to the norm. It looks a lot like 2019. It looks a lot like 2020. And we don't have it plotted here, but if we'd showed you 2018, 2017, 2016, 2015, 2014, going all the way back to the early 2000s, it would look a lot like those lines too. So 2021 was the aberration, and we've since sort of reverted back to the norm, but it hasn't been a super fast shift where we just sort of snap back to exactly where we were previously on menus. It's going to happen a little bit more gradually over time. So we didn't see the mirror image of 2021 in the opposite direction. We saw things sort of go back to the way they were in terms of annual change, which is why we think that balance basically has sort of been restored, and we're going to see continued progress towards more innovation, more interesting things on menus, but it's not going to all happen in the period of, just a couple of weeks.
And Jack, and I think there was a question in chat, I think maybe just a reminder to everybody that 2020 data was actually the pre-COVID data.
Yes.
All menus collected prior to COVID. So the COVID impact was the 2021 data.
Yeah. 2020, for everything we're showing today, 2020 means pre-COVID, 2021 means immediately after COVID, and 2022 means this past year. And I think along with all, there's only one thing you remember from today. I think it would be this, which is the big story, which is we're often known for something called the menu adoption cycle, or we call it the MAC. And 2022 is the year that we saw truly the return of the MAC. And for those of you that are not really familiar with the MAC, I think most of you probably are, but here's the 3-second lesson just in case. The menu adoption cycle basically says that every trend moves through 4 life stages. Inception is when it's really early on in fine dining, maybe some specialty types of places. Adoption, now you'll find that trend in fast casual restaurants and food trucks and gastropubs and those types of places. Proliferation, now chains are latching onto the trend. and ubiquity, that trend is everywhere, all, down to, a hospital cafeteria, for instance. So you can see here's what menu adoption cycles look like for cuisines. We do them for individual categories, like the ingredients you might find on a burger. And we saw largely a pausing of the menu adoption cycle in the immediate aftermath of COVID. But as the song goes, we've now seen a return of the MAC, where many of these things have resumed and are progressing again through their life stages. So if there were a theme song for the year, I think that would be it right there. Now, one thing we could do that's really interesting as it relates to the menu adoption cycle is we could look at the individual ingredients inside of an item. So let's take a look. We have this black garlic pappardelle dish, and we can see the ingredients and description for this particular restaurant item. We could say, well, look, we know that black garlic is an early stage trend. It's still in the inception stage of its life cycle. Pappardelle is in the adoption stage. And then you could see the MAC stage for all the other items inside this particular dish. Tomatoes and sausage are in ubiquity, fennel and broccoli rabe are in adoption, and roasted red pepper are in proliferation. And you can actually start counting these things out. And in this particular item, there's one thing in inception, that's the black garlic, 3 things in adoption, that's the pappardelle, the fennel, and the broccoli rabe. There's 1 item in proliferation, there's 2 items in ubiquity, and you can see what their share of all the things in the item are. So inception represents about 14% of this dish, right? So we're looking at individual ingredients inside individual dishes and sort of determining their share. And what we wanted to understand is, well, what if we didn't do this for just one dish? What if we did this for everything on the menu? Like, hundreds of thousands or approaching 1 million different items in the most recent menu trends data set. And when we ran that analysis and we compared it to what happened in the prior year, this is what we found. So if you look at the different, all the different foods, flavors, ingredients, black garlic and hundreds more that might be in the inception stage, then all those in the adoption stage, proliferation and ubiquity, and you see how many of those actually gained in prominence. It became more available on menus versus the prior year. So this is, what happened in the aftermath of COVID versus pre-COVID. You see that for the most part, it's pretty hard for any of those things to grow, right? Like 15%, 17%, 18%, 19% were gainers of those thousands of different foods, flavors, ingredients across these 4 stages of their life cycle, and most of them declined. If we look at what happened in 2022, the story becomes quite different. You have essentially a lot more items in ubiquity, that last stage of the life cycle, having returned back in force. This is largely because so many menus got just chopped up in the immediate aftermath of COVID, where just all sorts of items were plucked off menus, including things that had very common ingredients. And you're seeing a lot of those storm back. But in all those other sections, life stages of the menu adoption cycle, inception, adoption, proliferation, the thousands of different foods, flavors, ingredients that make up those life stages are this past year, as likely to have grown as they are to have declined, which is a much, much better picture than we saw the previous year, where almost everything was down. So if you remember, one of that first images we showed you was like these arrows that were sort of like rebounding off the ground. That's basically where we are right now. And if an object that stays in motion, in motion tends to stay in motion, it would suggest that these numbers will continue to go up and improve as innovation continues to return to the menu. So we thought it'd be interesting to take a look at maybe just some things that are actually growing on the menu, like very specific foods, flavors, ingredients, what have you. And here's a few of them. Who wants to talk about vegan cheese?
Yeah, so I think vegan cheese is an interesting one. So it has grown over the past year by 22%. I think the plant-based and plant-forward eating has been a huge trend, and we've been seeing that year after year for the past few years. But I think what's interesting about vegan cheese was that typically you see it with the meat analogs, and you see it grow on pizza. The fastest 12-month growth last year was on sandwiches and fries and salads. So we're really seeing it being more versatile and growing in versatility.
So are they putting vegan cheese on like a dish that has meat, or are they putting it only in other vegan dishes for the most part?
Well, I think that you still have, like they're still using it on pizza and, even some of the like meat pizza. But I think you're also seeing it being used a lot more you're seeing a lot more versatility. So does it, I think vegan cheese is more likely to go with a meat alternative than a meat alternative is to go with with vegan cheese. Does that make sense? Or the meat to go with vegan cheese. Does that make sense?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's look at another one. Emily, do you want to talk about oat milk?
Sure. Yeah, we've talked about this before, but I am always thinking about this one stat from our Plant Forward report this past year that we did with Culinary Institute of America, Food for Climate League, and Menus of Change. I feel like I have to mention all of them. But there was a question in that report about what is the top health benefit consumers seek from plant alternatives, and in general, plant-based alternatives. And the number one answer was digestive health benefits. And so something like that is obviously referring to oat milk or other milk alternatives, or vegan cheese too. So even people who are maybe not vegan or avoiding dairy for like humane reasons, whatever, they might just be trying not to have as much dairy for digestive purposes or health purposes. So oat milk just has all this potential crossing these different trends and consumer needs.
Yeah, and it's certainly not a new trend. We've seen this growing in multiple periods leading up to this year as well, but it's managed to continue. So we saw a number of things grow this year, but there's still some headwinds. So for something to grow this much in a single year is really quite significant. I'm still amazed at all the things you can apparently make milk out of these days.
The other thing I would say, Jack, about this one is actually oat milk is in, when we look at all the dairy-free offerings, it's actually in proliferation. And in 2018, it was in inception. So
it's moving very fast.
Yeah, it's moving very fast. So
yeah, for sure. And on the seasoning side, I feel like this is, I often say we don't really have a poster child for trends anymore, that it's really about a confluence of hundreds of different trends. But if you had to pick one, this might be a pretty good candidate. Anyone want to talk about tahini?
Yeah, tahini was, so we actually showcased this one in last year's State of the Menu as well. It grew by about the same percentage. So 1 year growth last year was 44%. So it grew by another 43%. And what I would say what's interesting also is we actually predicted it will grow by this much. So our haiku prediction was it was going to go up to a 3.2%, and we're right about that, like 3.1 percent growth this year.
So maybe to clarify that for folks that don't know, we built a AI machine learning model into menu trends that will predict where different foods and flavors will grow over the course of the subsequent 4 years, and we'll actually just make that prediction. It sounds like it got this one. It came within 1 percentage point of the actual growth rate, which is pretty good. But what are we seeing this on? What are some of the applications?
This is definitely skews toward beverages. So it's like used as a rim on different types of margaritas, but also shows up in food as well, although I'm a little less familiar with those applications.
And we're seeing this not just on menus, but we're seeing this in retail applications too, right? A lot in the snack aisle. So this is going to be, one of the things that determines whether something has long legs, has legs to grow. I don't know if they have to be long, is the versatility of that particular ingredient. And if it can be used in many different things. So we actually have something that we call a food versatility score that we report in SNAP, which says, hey, is this like an ingredient you can only find in one type of dish, or do you find it in like many different types of dishes? And when you see something like tahini that you could work in a beverage, it could work in an entree. I don't know, maybe we're even seeing it in like the occasional dessert every now and then. That's a pretty good indication that it has lots of ways to grow.
I'll share a personal story, and saying, Jack. So I never used it for anything but beverage before. Now I have Gen Z nieces, and every time I visit, they use it on everything. And so whenever I visit, family, I tend to also take that and put it on every food, on omelets in the morning, on sandwiches. So they use it on on everything, and it actually does bring a little flavor to a lot of foods.
Yeah, it might become a pantry staple. And then something like hot honey, which is awesome on a pepperoni pizza, but what else do we know about it?
I think this one is similar, that when we start, it's, got pretty low penetration, but when we look across menus, it does similarly cross, beverages, desserts, and savory foods as well, with the like sweet and spicy mixture. It seems to be a lot of, we're getting a lot of projects in about sweet and spicy, because it's just such a versatile, interesting addition to foods.
And some of the,
go ahead, Sean.
And some of the top pairings for this has been like pizza, sandwiches, and wings also in the past year.
Yeah, and I think one of the things too is not only is it a trend that's growing and ingredients become more popular, it sort of adds like a coolness to the dish too, doesn't it? It takes something and it makes it like sort of like fun or cool or interesting or daring or something all of a sudden. So emotionally, I think changes what some of those items are. Now, you can't really talk about food and menu trends these days, and it's actually I think it's like a sad like commentary on society that I'm about to say what I'm about to say, but you almost can't talk about trends today without thinking about what TikTok in particular is doing for trends. We used to live in a world where there were maybe a couple of really big food trends every year. We now live in one where that doesn't exist anymore. It's hundreds of smaller trends, and things that we used to think about as being fads that you want to avoid are actually now sort of micro trends that are worth engaging in. And TikTok has birthed a number of these, including some very recent ones. But perhaps one of the biggest ones that we've seen on the menu is this, right? The absolute explosion of birria tacos. The big TikTok field trend, up 91% on restaurant menus over the course of the last year. So these amazing tacos, and you sort of dip them in consomme. I don't know. I feel like this is probably not the healthiest food in the world, but it sure photographs and videos well. It's like highly TikTokable, Instagrammable, and quite delicious. Up 91% over the course of the last year. And there's other ones too, right? I think more recently you're seeing butter boards on TikTok. It's probably just a matter of time until some restaurants start doing this. I mentioned before when I was at a Persian restaurant in Atlanta, which has otherwise a pretty traditional Persian menu, they had corn ribs on their menu, right? They, like, hey, we serve authentic Persian cuisine plus this other weird TikTok food. And I think this is going to become more normal for restaurants. And actually the ones there were delicious. They did a great job. So here's a butter board. If you haven't seen this is like the one of the newest things on TikTok. It's being talked about in mainstream media now, as well as, one of the biggest food trends that TikTok has kicked off. But there's dozens, if not hundreds, of other ones too. Now there is one that's a really bad thing, and you may have seen this on the news. I think last week is when the FDA issued its warning to do not try to prepare this recipe at home. Have you all seen this? The Nyquil chicken, or they call it sleepy chicken, where you just sort of like cook or marinate your chicken in Nyquil or some other cold or cough syrup. But it is quite depressing that the FDA would have to issue a warning to the general public to not prepare and eat Nyquil chicken. Like, have we just become really dumb people? I don't know.
I can't imagine it tasting good, because like Nyquil doesn't taste good when you have to take it. So,
well, they say what happens is when you cook this thing with heat, it concentrates like the intensity of like the pharmaceutical aspects of it,
right.
And it could actually become toxic, right? Like it could kill. You can overdose on it. Imagine overdosing on chicken, and just the fumes from the preparation of it can send you to a hospital. So some TikTok trends are better than others. This one should go right into the garbage heap. But there's more stuff like this out there. It's crazy. At the same time, we saw some things drop on the menu. And Emily, I know you want to talk about you were about to say something around the Nyquil. And I feel like
I had just seen headlines. It's like, ugh, gross. And then I read an article, a little bit more about it. I guess it started as a joke some years ago, but then, took off because it's so weird. And then of course people actually try it.
Well, so if you remember, one of the things that we'll often show, if you want to think about how to think about Gen Z versus other generations, there's a chart. I'm going to try to replicate a chart with my hands right here. So imagine a chart that has an axis with the 4 different generations: Gen Z, Millennials, Gen X, and then Boomers. And then we have 2 lines, and one line represents, if you're going to have something new, try to eat something new for the first time. Is it because you think that it's going to taste great, that's what's going to draw you to do that? That's one line. The other line represents, if you're going to try something new, you're really going to do it just because it's new. You don't even care if it tastes good. You just want to try something new for new's sake. And the lines sort of do this. They intersect right here, where Boomers say, it better taste good or I ain't going to try it. But Gen Z is saying, I'll try something new just for new's sake, which is sort of what explains this Nyquil chicken thing. You're right. It probably tastes terrible. Okay. We also saw some things actually decline on the menu as well. I thought I'd maybe just call out a couple of them. Swordfish, hasn't been very popular for a while now, and it's actually shrunk an additional 33% on menus over the course of the last year. But even more interesting is that the specific reference, not just to a burger, but specifically to a half-pound burger, is also down about a third in just the past year. And I think, Sean and Emily, you were sort of, theorizing there's probably a confluence of things happening here, but perhaps the one thing that's happening the most that's driven the decline, not of burgers in general, but specifically calling out a half-pound burger, is beef prices are up quite a lot, right? It's a very expensive ingredient. And the movement from quarter pound to a third pound to a half pound, whatever the mammoth thing that is next, there's just not as much incentive to do that anymore. If you're an operator, your margins are already so crushed that you're probably going back to a more basic and not quite, large burger that uses as much meat. And with that in mind, I figure that's actually a pretty good segue to talk about the next thing that matters, which is what has inflation actually done on the menu over the course of the last year. So this is going to be data that goes a little bit further back because we wanted to do sort of an apples to apples. This represents our second quarter data, which takes us through like the end of, let's say, April 2022 in terms of when those menus were collected. We'll have a third quarter report shortly in the future, but let's just get a general sense of what's happened with menu pricing over the last year. Now, there is probably one good piece of news with all this inflation that we've been seeing, which is maybe this is the one thing that makes society, or people in the US finally say, let's just get rid of the penny at this point. It's like worth less than ever. That actually costs more than a penny to make a penny. It's like costs like 1.3 cents to make a penny or something. That it actually costs more than a nickel to make a nickel. It costs like 8.5 cents or something to make a nickel. I don't know why we have these things at this point. So maybe that'll be the silver lining of inflation as we get rid of these annoying things in our pocket. Like if you put a penny on the ground, do you even pick it up? No, it's not worth it.
Well, especially not after COVID, right?
especially not after COVID. So here's what's happened with menu price inflation over time. This is not what operators pay. This is what's being charged on the menu to consumers, normalized on a one-year basis, ending this last April. We saw an increase in prices of almost 6%, 5.9%. And you can see that number changes depending on the type of dish. Appetizers, entrees, and sides saw generally higher increases than beverages and desserts, but it's not drastically different, let's say. The more important thing to note is that 5.9% is totally eclipsed by the increase in food costs to operators. It's totally eclipsed by the increase in food at home costs to consumers, like grocery store costs. So menus did not rise in price nearly as much as food costs have overall, which means operators have taken a hit and they've, to their margins because they haven't adjusted their menu prices nearly as much as the market would normally demand that they do. I think this is because once you raise a price, it's really hard to bring it back down, and operators haven't been sure, like, oh my God, I've been holding on. Should I wait to see what happens with inflation? If I raise all my prices all at once, it might freak my customers out. They'll never come back. So they've been sort of holding on for dear life. But I think we've gotten to the point now where inflation has been so sustained for such a long period of time, and food costs continue to go up, that operators are going to finally give in, and you're going to see these menu price inflation numbers spike very, very dramatically to correct for all the price increases they haven't taken yet over the course of the next couple of periods. That gap is going to start to close as these menu inflation numbers continue to rise. I'm predicting at a fairly dramatic rate. Operators are going to finally say, hey, I'm not making any money. I can't do this anymore. I can't hold on anymore. I have to bite the bullet and just raise my prices in a substantial way. And if you look at the types specifically of dishes, we have a whole, like, over 100 different menu item types that we catalog, but I can't show them all on one chart. It gets too small. You can see that, for these select items that we have here, this is the increase in price. And again, it sort of is all over the board, with some types of categories, increasing in price much more so than others. Wings are up 12% while martinis are up 2%, for instance. So this is not an across the board standard menu increase that we've seen in pricing. It's been more selective on the part of the operator, oftentimes dealing with their own increase in food costs as well. And if you look at what's happened across all those menu items, those millions of menu items across the country, about half of them have increased in price over the course of the last year. Almost half have sort of stayed flat, and very few have decreased in price, right? I mean, it's basically a non-event. You're not seeing many price decreases at all. So about half of increase in price, but to me, I mean, that other half is going to have to go at some point. It's pretty hard to justify how those prices are going to stay flat for long. And of those 47% that already increased in price, they probably have not increased in price enough. They probably need to increase in price even further to get operators back to any sort of margin level they're historically been comfortable with. We see in one table that operators report that their margins have dropped on a relative basis by nearly 40% versus where they were pre-COVID because of rising food costs, rising labor costs, et cetera. They're going to have to make that up by raising the price on their menu. I think they've been really hesitant to do that for a while, and they've been trying to hold out, but I don't think they can hold out much longer. And if you look at the types of items that are most likely to have increased in price versus those that are least likely. So the numbers here are the percentage of all items of that type, all menu items of that type that saw a price increase, broken up by the most likely and least likely. And there's many, many more. We're showing like the top, I think 15 in each one of these buckets. It's actually quite interesting, right? You can see that beef entrees, pork entrees, shellfish entrees, all these things that are sort of protein intensive are the ones where you're most likely to have seen a price increase. And then on the least likely side, it's like fruit and beer and sparkling wine and alcohol and martinis and whatnot. They're less likely to have seen an increase. Now, the thing that's interesting, though, is because a lot of these items sort of on the right-hand side tend to be less expensive. They're not entrees, right? It's like a beverage, or maybe it's a small side dish, or it's something else that's normally just a couple of dollars on the menu. Any increase in those prices will register as a pretty big increase on a relative base, on a percentage basis, right? So if a $2 item goes to $2.25, that's a 12.5% price increase. For a $30 entree, that would be this equivalent of like a $3.75 price increase. So you're seeing more items that are sort of like protein centric, let's say, get a price increase. But those items on the right-hand side, even though fewer of them are seeing an increase, when they do increase, the increases tend to be quite large on a percentage basis because no menu is going to raise a price 5 cents, right? You're not going to go from $2 to $2.05. You're going to go from $2 to like $2.50, $3, something like that. And just by definition, because you're working off of a smaller price base, the percentage gains are going to be larger. So it's a really interesting dichotomy, right? Smaller price increases, but for many, many more items on the left, and generally larger percentage price increases but for a smaller universe of items that actually saw an increase on the right. Okay, my God, we're at the hour, so I'm going to go through this real quick. Scores data, which looks at what's happening at chain restaurants and all their new menu launches. Here's where we are with menu launches. This is the monthly number of new menu launches at top chains over time. You can see right now our monthly average is at 323 items per month are new to the menu at our top 200 chains. That puts us at about 91% of where we were pre-COVID. So we've recovered, but we're not fully back to 100% just yet. And remember too that this is the average uniqueness as rated by consumers for all items launched over time over the last few years at major chain restaurants. And we've had a nice upward trend for a while, but it seems like we've sort of started shifting in the opposite direction since the beginning of this year. Now, we probably need a longer time series to really confirm that there really is a downward trend in the perceived uniqueness of new dishes on menus at chain restaurants. But my guess is it probably is true. Right. And some of it might be perceived because consumers finally got back into restaurants and they got to try new stuff again and they got used to trying new things. So that the next thing they see that gets released may not feel quite as new to them anymore because they've been exposed to some of the new stuff at restaurants since they got back into it. At the same time, I think that movement to value that many chains are doing right now often flies in the face of innovation itself. And we move to like combo meals and value pricing, and you know, our new menu innovation is offering this for $3.99 as opposed to $4.99. That doesn't feel very unique to consumers, which could be contributing to this as well. And just as a reminder for all of us, look, we want stuff that's interesting and new and unique in restaurants across hundreds of different foods. When we ask consumers, this is an older stat that we've shared a few times, but I think it's so important. If you were going to eat this item, would you want to have it, get it away from home or have it from home? Across hundreds of different dishes and foods, these are the things that people most said they want to have away from home if they're going to have it. And if you compare that with the list of things at the bottom that people say, yeah, if I'm going to have it, I'm just happy to get it from the house instead, sort of that blue chunk of the line. So the things at the top are things that people most want to get away from home versus things that people most want to get from home. The difference is pretty obvious to us, right? You have a lot more interesting, globally influenced, and globally inspired foods in that away from home list at the top. That's what people want from restaurants, things that they can't make from home, things that come from around the world, you know, things that are inspired and multicultural. And if you ask people, hey, on a cuisine basis, would you rather have that cuisine away from home or from home? Other than American food, everyone wants to have stuff away from home instead. That is the advantage that restaurants convey. And one last word of caution to the industry. If we go too deep into a value-based innovation strategy, which is not really innovation at all in most cases, it's just price changing. If we get away from bringing all these globally inspired influences onto the menu, we're going to take away the one reason that consumers really want to go out to restaurants. So we think we need to continue pushing innovation forward. It looks like independent restaurants are doing that. We hope that all of you that represent the big chains and that are suppliers to big chains will continue to do that as well. Okay, this report, the 2022 State of the Menu, sort of in report form, not webinar form, with even more detail, will be available tomorrow in Report Pro for all Report Pro subscribers. So go check it out there. It's great. I think Emily and Sean are just putting the finishing touches on that report as we speak. But this should be a must read and a must share with inside your organization. And in 2 weeks, we're going to be talking about sustainability. It's going to be a fascinating conversation. We think that this is a topic that just gets louder and louder all the time. We have brand new research on sustainability that we're going to be sharing. So let your colleagues know. And I'm sorry we went way over on time. Supposed to be getting better at this. Apparently I'm not good at this yet. So thanks everyone. We will see you real soon. Sorry for the talking really fast at the end. I don't know how I just messed up the time so bad, but see you everybody.